The Center for Procurement Excellence is a nonprofit member organization with a mission of educating, promoting, and advocating for better RFP processes. Join CPE today and make your RFPs faster and more transparent. Membership also includes discounts to all of our training and networking events. CPE hosts a variety of virtual and in-person networking and training events throughout the year. Visit our website to get signed up. CPE Speakers Bureau is available for your regional and national meetings and professional conferences. Contact us to learn more.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
So, we're going to talk about this new acronym. Since we in procurement love acronyms, RFS, Request for Solutions. Let's dig into this whole topic here. So, the agenda is that we're going to walk through what a request for solution is. Sometimes, let me see the CE link not working. When I pulled it up here, it was working for me, but it could be under heavy load right now if everyone's trying to get there. So you can go do this anytime across the next month to get in there for the CEU. It looks like I got there a minute ago and now it's loading. So it's quite possible our website is going a little slow. I'll check back on that here in a moment. Yeah, you all bombarded it. So now I have to go deal with two technical difficulties here in 1 month. We'll get it figured out for you. Okay. So RFS or challenge RFPs, they are becoming more popular. So let's talk about how they work. I'll walk through a couple of examples of what this may look like if you were to use them. And then that's the plan. So the actual agenda here is this. We'll go through what these things even are. So what is a request for solution or challenge RFP? Then we'll go through two things an RFS is and isn't, and then a couple overlooked things that folks need to keep in mind if you want to use this approach to have success. And we'll summarize things out from there and give you some additional resources that are coming up through the RFP Doctor series. So what is it? So let's start there. What is a request for solution, sometimes called a challenge RFP? So let's compare and contrast here with a traditional RFP. So a traditional RFP in general, the solution that you're going out for, the services that you're seeking, those are known typically. Your scope or your specifications or your requirements can be pretty well defined by your internal client team or agency because you have a pretty straightforward or well-known need that you're defining. What that typically does is it gets expressed in more of a specific or prescriptive scope. You have your list of requirements, things like that. It's pretty well structured. If you're in the design and construction world, obviously plans and specifications there, super well detailed. And you'd use an RFP, of course, when you want to collect both cost or financial competition and when you want to see qualifications or proposals from those firms who are competing, not just a low bid. That's when you use the RFP. Now, on the other side, maybe you have a slightly more unknown solution or approach, or maybe the approach can be varied to meet your need. The scope itself consists more of your current challenge as a client and what you're trying to achieve or what your performance outcomes would be. You tend to have a slightly more open-ended scope here, and you're seeking innovation, you're seeking new ideas, and it's well suited for those types of scenarios that have a little bit more ambiguity, trying to get my head out of the way, where you want a true transformational experience. Now, they both can be competed via solicitation. They could still have a streamlined and efficient and effective solicitation process or not trying to bog things down. Can be open to innovation on both sides. We'll talk about that as we go. And that, of course, things will vary on any individual scenario. So in theory, this is how a request for solution works. The client says, hey, external vendor or supplier community, here's my challenge, here's my issue, here's my problem. This is what I'm trying to accomplish. This is the outcome that I'm seeking. And here's what I look like today where I do not currently have this outcome or I have not yet achieved it. So those two things highlighted here are really how the client is explaining their challenge. It's not just like, hey, I have a problem. It's here's what I'm trying to accomplish versus here's what I look like today. I'm looking for some external partner to bring me on this journey and help me get to that outcome. From the starting point of where I'm at right now. And then the solicitation itself is asking the supplier community, how do we get this done? How do we get from point A to point B? That becomes the solution. So request for solution. Yes, the slide deck is supposed to be viewable right now. Are others seeing the slide deck? I'm seeing the slide deck. with my lovely self blocking the corner here. So might be something going funky there if you're not able to see it, because it looks like we're seeing a lot of folks chiming in that they can. So that's the basic idea here. So that's why you'll also get that name challenge RFP. That's going back to these prior 2 points where the client says, here's the challenge I'm trying to solve. We're looking more for performance outcomes here. And then how we actually get there, the means and methods, the technical specs of how it's done, that can be more open-ended. So sometimes you'll hear that term challenge RFP rather than request for solution. Okay. Now, the way this works in terms of general steps, you're still doing most of the same steps you would do for any other RFP. You're preparing that scope or statement of work internally and gathering requirements, or in this case, expressing your challenge and current conditions. You're going to advertise that. If it were an RFP, you typically advertise the RFP. You get your proposals back. You evaluate them. You move forward into the contracting process itself. In this case, all we're doing is saying the solicitation is slightly different. It's this request for a solution or challenge RFP. If you want my full confession here, every time I've done this approach, I've still called it an RFP. I've not actually changed the name. I've not made it an RFS acronym. I've not called it a challenge RFP. It's just still an RFP, but it's just a slightly different setup. But nowadays, you're seeing more and more folks differentiating this as its own pathway to go, hence the new acronym of RFS, even though I've personally never used it as many times as I've done this before. So there's that question. Will these be available? Yeah, the recordings usually go up after the session, so I'll point that out to you of where that's going afterwards as well. So you see you'll see all the slides stuff in there. Now, I've kind of talked about the differences in terminology and how even I'm doing this topic for you today. I've not ever really called it an RFS or challenge RFP. I've actually been at various conference venues and conducting trainings on this topic and had people come up to me and say, hey, don't you call that a challenge RFP or don't you call that an RFS? And that's actually where I first learned of this terminology, was others attending the training saying, that really has a different name out there sometimes. So if you're not familiar with the terminology, neither was I, no big deal. And as we all know in procurement, there's a lot of terminology out there. One example that I like to use in this is if you've ever heard of a BAFO, best and final offer, go back and check our prior recording from just over a year ago in December of 2023, where we covered BAFOs. And all we really did in that session was cover the 5 most common types of BAFOs, all of which are either slightly or extremely different, right? So just because we use the same acronym of BAFO doesn't mean we all are referring to the same thing. Likewise, the terminology here with RFS or challenge RFPs, if you don't use that specific terminology, that's totally fine. I didn't either. So yeah, Shane, you've been using the RFS for years, just haven't called them that. Yeah, same as us. It's pretty, we've got the same experience. And Shane, go USA. All right, so let's go into the meat of the content here. So let's go into 2 things that the RFS is to flesh this out a little bit further. So it tends to require a different mindset in how you're scoping and gathering requirements for your solicitation. So when I say the scope or SOW, so many of you have seen this slide before, all we mean is the client is expressing what they're hiring that external vendor or supplier to do. So whether you call it a scope or requirements or specifications or whatever your terminology is, again, I know that all differs, just whatever it is that you're hiring the suppliers to do for that particular solicitation, that's your scope or your SOW. Normally in a typical RFP that's going into your RFP itself, that's describing here's what this project is about, here's what the client's trying to purchase, and the rest of the RFP is getting into how you're going to compete it, how you're going to evaluate it, how you're going to award it, plus all your procurement rules and administrative requirements and all that type of stuff. So when you're in the RFS scenario, or request for solutions, again, regardless of whether you put the acronym of S on there, what you're going to do is that statement of work, your scope, is going to be focused more on what is that challenge rather than any detailed technical specifications and detailed requirements, a little bit more about the challenge. Now, you can caveat that challenge with some specs in there too of, hey, we have to do these things. That's all part of it. And you're still going to want to focus on your current state or your current conditions. That gives the context to the supplier community about what they're coming into if they win this project and are taking you on that journey to get to that solution. So it's a little different. Now, in the request for solutions or in this type of RFP, you're really focusing more on your goals and outcomes, along with that current state environment. Now, I'm going to give you some details here. You're not expected to read all of this. I mean, I suppose you can parse it out in the recording later if you want to and go crazy full screen on it. But what I'm about to show you is one of the largest bookstore services contracts in United States history. And this was the entirety of the scope that we put together for it with that client. So this was on behalf of a large university that we were helping. And you can see here that we had fewer than 8 pages to describe the entirety of the scope for this ginormous tens of hundreds, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of service size here. So it was a big behemoth. By the way, this particular client had previously performed all of their bookstore services across the university in-house. So it was all in-house state employees. It was a state school. And then this was being outsourced for the full time. So just imagine the complexities of that and some of the political challenges with that, like a big challenge there. And yet still the entirety of this scope was less than 8 pages. And so I'm going to read some of it to you just to give you a sense of the type of content that can be valuable in this type of a scenario. So we went through the programmatic goals, like what was the client trying to accomplish? What was this university trying to accomplish in outsourcing its bookstore services for the first time? And so some of these are pretty simple. I'm just going to hit you with the top 5 or 6. So like number 1, achieving world-class customer satisfaction. That was a primary goal. We want to be able to grow if the student population grows and expands. Want to be competitive, right? We all know that the students out there are aware of the secondhand purchasing opportunities for their textbooks. So we want to be competitive here, drive an increase in sales annually. We want this thing to grow over time in terms of revenue generation for this university. We want the outsourced vendor or supplier to come in to provide these services, also to invest in the facilities and the program to make them world-class. We want to provide a significant financial return to this university, so on and so forth. You can see we did have 26 things we were trying to accomplish, but they're all outcome-oriented and aspirational in nature. There were some other goals in there as well. So we had some management expectations. We said, hey, we want a service provider, a bookstore manager who's a leader in this field and is going to view this account as a flagship account, incubator for new programs, technology services, and so on. So we want innovation here, and we want that vendor to assign an awesome team to help us out to do this. And we want them to be collaborative with us on the university side and our key stakeholders, right? So some of this is pretty straightforward, things that you think is like, yeah, that seems pretty normal. Want to interface with the university seamlessly and so on. We've got some HR expectations that since we're outsourcing here, all of the current bookstore employees must be retained for a period of 2 years from the beginning date of the contract. All their wages need to be similar and meet all HR policies of the university here, even though you're coming in as an external provider, yada, yada, yada. And we reference the policy. And there are some other goals in there as well. And we said, hey, we want that vendor, whoever we select, to develop and maintain a system of performance measurement so we show that we're getting value out of this. So again, not saying exactly how to do things, more of the aspirational goals of what we're trying to accomplish. And then the entirety of the scope after that was just current conditions. We had done an upfront market research technique called the request for needs, which we can talk about at a future time. So these questions that you're seeing in here actually were received from the interested service providers. We asked them, what's the most important information that you need to see or need to know in order to put together an accurate proposal and financial structure with minimal contingency? So these are some of the questions they had asked us back then. Give us the last 3 years of sales, tell us about inventory, all this type of stuff that we had in there. We were answering their questions about our current state environment, and that was it. I mean, you add all that up, and I go back here, that was the entirety of the 8 pages. You can see the tables in here of the current states and some of the listing of goals. And that was it for the entire scope for a pretty big outsourcing, political, complex service. That was it. That's all we did. So you can keep it streamlined like that. Now, that does make it more streamlined. It does make it less prescriptive. You do need to be pretty darn transparent on your current state, and it does take a different philosophy in how you're putting together this scope and getting the right information in there. And not all of the internal client teams that we've worked with are really able to do this. A lot of them want to have that big laundry list of technical requirements. And so it's a mindset shift as much as anything else, just is all I want to say there. Another thing that the request for a solution or challenge RFP is going to be a different approach to evaluating. So if you think about most of your RFPs that you see, you've got two things you're primarily seeing as part of the written proposal response from your vendor community. They're either verifying their past experience and their qualifications, or they're proposing how they're going to deliver your project, which communicates their understanding of your needs and your scope. Well, in an RFS, that past focus is not quite as important. It's really much more important about what they're promising to do for you if they are selected. So that's what's a little bit different. Now, it's going to be challenging because we all know in procurement, we want things to be as apples to apples as possible. But in this particular case, we didn't specify whether we want the green Granny Smith apple or the red delicious apple or any other varietal here. We didn't get into those technical details. We said we want an apple and we want to eat it and enjoy it. But exactly what those details are and how this is going to happen, and are they going to give it to us sliced, those things are open-ended here. So it's a bit of a different evaluation where it can still be apples to apples, but it is also open-ended and innovative at the same time. So let me explain that a little bit further. So what we think is a best practice in these scenarios is this. We'll typically set a baseline scope and expectation for all of the vendors or suppliers to compete to, and that would be the expression of the client's best guess or best articulation of what they think the right solution is for this scenario. So, hey, assume that X is the right solution, propose what's best. That could still be pretty open-ended, but we're at least we're trying to give a consistent playing field here. And then what you can do as a client is you can provide one or two other optional scenarios for your vendors to respond to. You can say, okay, what if you take base case X and you start adding some additional assumptions, or we start loosening things up from there and making it a little more open-ended? How would that change your proposal? And then you can go all the way to the extreme and completely make it open-ended and say, if I remove all constraints from you vendors, what would you do differently? Explain that to me. And that way you're still at least getting some comparison standpoint where they're proposing to something consistent-ish, and then you're still letting them be very innovative in what they're proposing to you on the other areas. So let me give you a couple examples. These are all real examples. I'm going to give you not pretty slides. I'm going to give you just screenshots of real projects that we have helped with to try to paint this or illustrate this a little bit further. And I'm going to show you that bookstore services example first, and then some others after that. So in that bookstore services example, the same 8-page scope that we walked through earlier, what we had is a financial proposal section where we wanted commissions being returned. This is a revenue generating contract back to the client. So what percentage of overall sales and revenue are going to be returned to that client group? Are there minimum guaranteed commissions? And what is the capital investment that was going to be guaranteed as well? And we said, this is the financial structure we're going to use, and you must retain all existing employees for 2 years. So that was the base case that we are competing everyone against. Then we said, hey, there's a second option. Here's option B, where we say everything else is going to be the same. We're going to keep all of the financial structure the same, but we're going to allow the vendors to propose what is the best way to handle the retention issue. What do they recommend? Are they going to recommend longer or different? Maybe they've done this before and have different ideas than we have as a university in that case. So we let that be more open-ended. And then option C was completely wide open. We literally said, you can adjust anything you want. You can change the financial structure, whatever it is, make your case. You've only got a page to get this, high level changes communicated to us. So you can do it like that, where you got a consistent base case, slightly more open, and then completely wide open on the ends. Okay. Let me check one thing here on a technical item on the background that you are not quite seeing here on the screen. I know. Okay, I'm going to give you more examples of that here in a moment, just making sure where they're coming up. Okay, let's talk about a couple things that the RFS is not. It is not a one-size-fits-all. So in other words, there's not a single template for this. I think we had a few requests in advance of this topic to send out a template. There's not really a template for it, and the reason being is the stuff that I was just showing you, that it depends on your specific scenario and how open you want to go and where that base case needs to be, which can adapt to your specific goals as a client group. And I'll show you more examples of that here in a moment. So you do need to tailor this to your specific situation. This is not a copy and paste exercise where there's just a set template for it. So definitely not copy and paste. Let me give you a few more examples that will hopefully illustrate the point and also give you inspiration to go try this on your own, or give you inspiration. And we're happy to chat with you on this. If you're like, hey, I think I have this project coming up, it might be a good fit for it, and you want to brainstorm with us at CP, happy to do that. Not a problem. So this one, completely different project type. This was for a big student residence. This is a different university, actually. We were helping here in the Midwest, kind of where I'm located. And this was a public-private partnership. If you're familiar with those, great. We won't get into all those details, but just picture brand new student dormitory that was being designed and built. So we didn't even have the program of what this was going to look like. We basically said this. Base case is 250 beds. Here's the preset financial of how we want to do it. We wanted the public-private design build partner to come back to the client and say, we're going to pay, the design builder was going to pay for everything up front. So the full design and construction services essentially was kind of paid for by them, so to speak. And then it was leased back to the university or the college in this case. And we said, we have no idea how long it would take to do you have no idea how to, we were like, we didn't know what the time period would be for something like this. We had never done it before. So we said, well, here's our genius logic, right? We said, a lot of mortgages are 30 years. So why don't we go ahead and set this as a 30-year payback term that the public-private partner is going to come in here, design and build this thing. We need the 250 beds. And we wanted to know some financial investment information and some details there. We said, we'll pay you back in 30 years. What lease rate would we have to charge to make this all work with your upfront investment? So there's a different financial components going on here. Option 2, we said, same thing, 250 beds, got to do all the same type of financial structure that we've asked for, but let's let the public-private partners and developers and design builders tell us what they think the optimal term limit would be. Is it this 30 years right? Should we be shorter than that? Should we be longer than that? What does that look like? So that was slightly opening up a little bit more. And then we said, wide open, do what you want. You've seen us describe our needs. You can even change the number of beds that we have in here. You can change anything you want and describe it to us there. So basically the point I'm making is you have a base case that is a little bit more structured, tries to get a little bit more apples to apples, still knowing that this is more of an innovative, how you get there and accomplish the goals type of approach rather than a really detailed out perfect spec from the client. But then you can have the more wide open side of things as well. So we provided all three, Evan. So that's as you can see form H1, H2, H3. These are just screenshots from the solicitation that I had helped prepare in that case. And so everyone had to compete option 1. They had the options of competing in number 2 and number 3. They didn't have to. Everyone did. Everyone in those cases did compete in option 3. We're only 2 and 3 and gave different tweaks even in this case. So that's what I'm trying to say is you set up your most likely best guess as a client. So you try to get it more apples to apples that way. But to be honest with you, in almost I think in every case that we've done this, the client usually ends up going with the wide open solution in the end because they get innovative ideas that they hadn't thought of themselves that make it worth it. So again, got to do this within your legal constraints, got to do it within the comfort level of your organization, and most importantly, that internal client group who's going to be living with this going forward. Another quick example is a travel management solution. So you're starting to see, I gave you a design builds, public-private partnership example, but really the most common type of stuff is going to be services here is where we've seen this the most. So this is a travel management outsourcing on behalf of an institution. And in this case, you can see, hey, there's going to be an option A, an option B, and option C that we're looking at. And then there's an option D that's optional, which can be completely an alternative pricing model. So similar. Yeah, it's very similar to a lease back method in that case, Johnny. We actually ended up going a different route on that project based upon some of the ideas that came back, but that's another story for another day. All right, and this one for travel management, this one was that in this case, it was another university. This one was a friend up in Canada that we were helping back in the day. And this university had a previous travel management service provider. And so they said, we're going to compete this RFP based upon the existing financial model that the university is used to. So you can see all these different fees for different things happening, booking air tickets and yada, yada, yada. That's the current model. And we said, okay, we're going to use the current financial model. That's basically our current state of how things are happening now. But we are going to exclude the athletic teams, and we're going to specify an initial 3-year term. That was the base case. Then option B was if you were just going to handle all the athletic stuff. There's enough differences in handling athletics for a university compared to the broader university travel that they wanted to keep this separate. That was a client choice. So we had option A was base case here for all university-wide services. Option B here is athletics only. So that's not really an RFS or a request for solutions or challenge RFP yet. That's just different bid options or different scope areas within a broader service, of course. And then this is where we had the wide open option. We said, hey, actually, that's not true. Then we said, if you do it together, if you win both, what does that look like? So again, typical bid options and adding things together. It was option D in this case. It was the fourth option where we said, this is your alternative proponent generated solution. Got to use the Canadian language of proponents here. So proponent generated solution, and it was just wide open. I'll read a little bit to you. So, hey, provide a narrative of what you think the optimal financial agreement is. We weren't really changing the services here, but it was more of the financial structure could change. If there's a better and more beneficial way to structure the finances, that was really the open-ended part that we were taking a look at here. So we told them you can't exceed 2 pages. You can provide this for university travel and the athletics portion or both of them together. At minimum, I know we're leaving this open-ended. You got 2 pages to sell us on it, but at minimum, you got to talk about these things in there. So Esmeralda's questions here, are they expected to provide all 3 proposals where they can choose? They had to do the base one. In this case, they've got 4. They're probably going to propose option A. They're probably going to propose to do athletics 2, which means they're going to give us the both version, and they're going to do, this is just a pure option. If they wanted to give us option D, they could, but they're not required to. If I go back to the prior examples, like the student housing one, they were required to do the 30-year preset financial structure, and they were not required to do the others. Those were optional, but everyone did it because the more you start opening things up, the more ideas they started to get. And then same thing back on this bookstore example. Everyone had to do the base case. They did not have to give the other options, but everyone did in that case. And we ended up going with one of the wide open options in that version or that solicitation in the end. So you make it optional. This is actually the response. I won't read it to you, but you can see like the different responses came back here and how they set it up. There's some details of how this one worked, but they basically had an at-cost model for a dedicated travel management team to that individual institution and had a way to offset their costs based upon volume of usage, and it completely aligned the incentives between both a vendor and university to maximize the number of transactions going through their booking system and through the service and gained a dedicated team. So some interesting things there. Okay. Couple other things that the request for solutions is not. Again, it's not a perfect tool for just any single project, right? The examples that we've been showing you are mostly services related. These are a listing of some examples where we've personally used it when helping organizations. It's usually for service-oriented projects that have clear goals, but there's a lot of different ways that service can be operated. So not for everything. I did show you a couple examples where we were just using it, not for the service and the scope, but mostly to look at the financial model and how the financials were set up. Like in that travel management example, the services were about the same, but the financial model of how it was structured was different across the options. That example of the student housing, I mean, we knew that we wanted to house a certain number of beds. We knew where it was going to be located on the property of that college, but some of the other details of the design and how the financial structure worked, that's the part that we were opening up as options. So there's different ways of how you look at this. But you can and should include innovation in all of your RFPs, even if it's not a request for a solution, right? So we do recommend, most of you have seen this before in some recommendations, that we do recommend even for your normal RFPs that you have an entire evaluation criteria where you do ask the vendor community, the supplier community, hey, if you were the, if you've worked with me before, you've heard me say the emperor of the world question. Hey, vendor, if you were the emperor of the worlds, what would you change about our scope, about our parameters, about anything we've asked you to do, means and methods, technical recs, whatever? What would you change to improve the project, and tell me why it's beneficial? So I would do this in every RFP that you can, because the number of times you do get a good idea coming back that makes it worthwhile is fairly frequent. You don't always get a home run. Usually it's incremental things, and they're actually helping, the vendor community is helping you fix your scope and make it even better and covering gaps and things like that, which leads to better competition, which we can talk about. But that's something I would do in every RFP. So in other words, what I'm telling you is you can use a little bit of the spirit of the request for solutions in every RFP within just kind of segmenting it to an individual evaluation criterion. And most of you have seen this example before. We give it quite a bit. This was an example of a home run version of asking that emperor of the world question here. Hey, vendor community, what would you do differently to improve the project? In this case, if you've seen this example before, the shorthand of it is you can tell that in this picture, there was an issue. There was an explosion. This is a rocket launching facility. There was an explosion that affected both the launch facility there on the left and the hangar on the right. And so this project was the construction renovation to go in and fix everything that you see here. And so in this case, the designer actually went so far as to specify everything about the means and methods of how this is going to be done. Because it was a windy site, what the designer did is they specified that there's going to be a scaffolding built 360 degrees fully around the launch facility here, because it's pretty tall, multiple stories tall. You're going to have workers up there at heights who are going to be removing the old damaged stuff and installing new stuff. They're worried about safety with the excessive winds. So that was spec'd in. That was into the spec, was this specific means and methods of how to do this thing. And every contractor bidding on this work had to price that into their proposal. But we still asked them this question up here. Hey, if you're the emperor of the worlds, is there anything you would change about our scope, about our specs, to be different than what we've asked for? So in that case, one of the vendors came back and said, yeah, let us delete the scaffolding. We're actually going to tie it to structural steel and rappel off the side, work that way. These are actual pictures of them doing that on oil rigs offshore with worse weather and worse wind conditions. They found that was the only way that they could safely work. They had a proprietary, I don't know how you call it, kind of rigging system. You can see how the worker, this is probably the best worker to view of how they're set up, and they could angle themselves for welding purposes. They had this proprietary pulley system that they used. It ended up being way cheaper than the initial process that was spec'd into the project. It was faster than the specified process, safer than the specified process. And we ended up going with it, worked out well. They finished, it looked awesome. And there's a nice marketing pictures of where it turned out in the end. So again, all I'm telling you here is this is not exactly a request for a solution. It was a normal RFP, fully spec'd out, plans and specs, everything. But we did ask that question of, hey, would you recommend that we change anything? And if so, why? What's the benefits? It's a way to incorporate the same spirit of innovation in a much, much more limited sense. Now, let me go back to the question there of how do you evaluate? There's different ways to evaluate. I'm kind of skipping that because it's so situation specific. But here's the way we would typically do it. Maybe this bookstore one's a good one to do. So notice a few things here in what I'm showing. So in this bookstore one, right, let's look at the base case. So again, the idea of that the client tries to specify as much as they can to keep it as apples to apples as they can, while also then there's these other options on the side that get progressively more wide open. So let's ignore those for a moment. Where your core evaluation is going to occur is here at the base case. In that base case, notice what I've said here. This is attachment 5. So presumably this RFP had other attachments and other things we are asking the vendor community to submit. And notice the title of this attachment. This is just financial proposal. So we're switching the financial structure across these options. Plus we are talking about some of the scope in terms of how the retention is going to work with the existing in-house employees for the bookstore, right? So there is some scoping stuff changing. And we did say, go ahead, vendor, on the open-ended scenario. You can change whatever you want at your discretion. You just got to make it clear to us. But my point here is this is not all that we're asking the vendors for. You can still basically run an RFP off of the base case in whatever way you would normally run it. Yeah, your scope is a little bit different here. Your scope is a little bit more goal-oriented and current state descriptive than what you might have before. But if you wanted to have all your technical specs and details in there in the base case, you could. And you're basically running an RFP on the base case. So if you want to ask for qualifications, you want to ask for them to respond to a requirement sheet, you want to ask for the vendors to give you a proposal, a project plan, you want to interview them, you want to demo them, whatever you would normally do in an RFP, go ahead and do it here. So that's how you evaluate. You evaluate the exact same way you always would. But then in parallel, you're also slowly peeling back and giving more flexibility. And that could be happening in parallel. There's different ways that is handled. That's a much longer conversation, I suppose, that is organization specific and gets your legal counsel involved too on how to do this. But that's typically how it is done in a nutshell. So I hope that is helpful. And then on the side here, these can be scored. These can be, so we've had it done in certain client groups where the option C, the wide open stuff, is for reference information only. There's different rules in Canada sometimes with the contract A, contract B things to navigate. And making sure that everything that you're using was collected up front as part of the initial proposal. That's kind of the big hurdle with some of that. So there's different ways in how you actually evaluate these other areas and how you score that in. Easiest way to think about it though is if you're used to doing a scoring process for like bid area A, bid area B, or scope area A, scope area B. In other words, having bid alternatives, this is really not that different from having bid alternatives and how you structure things to keep it organized on the back ends. Let me hit a couple more things though, because clearly this is a little bit different. There are a few things that can be overlooked that we want to point out to you if you're going to do something like this. Number one is you have to really make sure that you explain your situation specifically and your solicitation structure very explicitly to your vendor community who's going to participate. So if you're doing like a typical pre-proposal meeting where everybody falls asleep and it's boring and you're reading the RFP to them, that's not going to work. And if you think that, hey, we changed the title of our cover sheet to say request for solutions. This is not an RFP. This is really different this time. You know that the vendors are going to react by rolling their eyes and saying, yeah, whatever. We don't care what clients call the RFP or the solicitation. They're asking me to submit a bunch of stuff to get something done. So if you want to try to do something a little differently here, just remember the vendors are not automatically going to believe you. And other clients have trained them to submit boilerplate junk every time. So if you want them to come up with a solution and think innovatively and communicate that, that's going to take some advanced notice. It's going to take some advanced outreach. You have to make it as simple as possible. You have to really walk them through during the pre-proposal sessions. We've even done it where you've had to have 2 of those to make sure that they're fully getting what you're after here. Sometimes it's an advanced information session before the solicitation even comes out. There's different ways to do that as well. My main point here is, again, this is not a template where you just have a template language and you issue it, and expect the vendor community to just get in line and do things a little differently. It's not going to work that way. You have to handhold them a little bit and walk them through it and get them, this is going to sound soft and squishy for me as an engineer, but you're getting the vendor community to believe and to trust you to do something a little bit differently here. And the second thing that's often overlooked is you really need to have a solid negotiation or clarification period here, because there's a chance that you're going to accept and ultimately contract for one of the more wide open solutions that was creatively proposed to you, in which case the lift or the burden on getting that negotiated properly into your final agreements, it's going to take a little bit more work, because it's possible that you're getting new ideas, new means and methods beyond what you even expected as a client. And you need to make sure you do your homework on that before you sign a dotted line. So you have to go into this thinking that your negotiation or clarification period might be a little bit more lengthy. So all I mean by that is when proposals come in, you go through your evaluation process as normal. That negotiation phase at the end before you get to the contract, that might be a little more bulky, might be a little bit longer. We've talked about this in prior sessions together, that a lot of times negotiations are focused on that contract or agreement. But really in this case, you're going to have to do that parallel effort of clarifying and planning out the scope of the service, and that's where your team should be focused on. We do recommend a process for how you go through this. If you want more details on that and like how to get all that done, I'm not going to belabor the point here. We've covered that in prior sessions back around Thanksgiving time. We had all the steps of this process and what that means to give you some ideas of how you might go about it in a structured sense. So it's not just open-ended and willy-nilly. And then we gave an example of negotiating for risks last month. So there's some ideas there as well. There's a much broader, training that can go into that. There's a few things that you really have to focus on during that clarification period. And one thing just to let you know is we're going to have dedicated RFP doctor sessions on numbers 2 through 5 here, and give you some real examples of how to negotiate and plan and clarify these things in the future. But you're going to have to go through all of this within an RFS scenario or a challenge RFP scenario. So stay tuned for those. We're going to have more examples of those coming up in the future. Okay, so that's a lot of me talking. I know there's questions and things like that. So to summarize here, we went through 2 things the RFS is. It's a slightly different approach to scoping, a little more goal-oriented on here's the outcomes I'm trying to achieve rather than having all the detailed requirements. But again, you can do that. If this is all confusing to you, then just say you can run the RFP in the base case how you normally would, but then you have some parallel evaluation streams that open things up a little bit more to innovation, to creativity, and see what you get. A couple things the RFS isn't that we covered. It's just not a one size fits all. It's not just a template. You customize it to the needs of your specific scenario, typically within a service-based scenarios where you're going to see it the most. And then you have to get your vendors on board, of course, with your internal teams as well. And it's going to be a heavier lift on the back end of negotiations. So don't lose sight of that as well. So to summarize, this can be a great approach. We've had highly successful project outcomes using this technique in the past. Be aware that it is a little bit different, right? It's going to be different on scoping and evaluations, a little bit different on how you engage with your internal, external folks. Internal, external, education, outreach, onboarding, buy-in is really the blank I could have filled in here. And you're going to have a more thorough clarification process beyond just the typical negotiation steps that happen there. It takes the right client with the right training and approach and mindsets to then go out and execute accordingly to then use the RFS.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.